By the late 4th century, around the 380s and 390s AD, the Roman Empire no longer functioned as a unified political system across all its territories. Administrative strain, military overstretch, and fiscal pressure had already reshaped imperial governance. Authority increasingly depended on regional commanders, local elites, and negotiated arrangements rather than direct central control. This process did not begin in 476 AD, but by that year its consequences became formally visible in Western Europe. In 476 AD, the last Western imperial officeholder was removed from power. No successor was appointed. The imperial court in Italy ceased to function as a coordinating authority for the Western provinces. This event marked the end of Western Roman imperial rule, not the end of Roman society. What followed was an administrative discontinuity rather than a sudden collapse of population, culture, or settlement. Before 476, the Western Roman government had relied on taxation collected across provinces to fund professional armies, civil administration, and judicial enforcement. These systems required stable revenue flows, trained officials, and reliable communication. By the early 5th century, these mechanisms had weakened. Tax collection became uneven. Military units were often maintained locally rather than rotated centrally. Civil offices persisted in name but lacked enforcement capacity. After 476, imperial taxes were no longer collected on a transregional scale in the West. Coin minting declined sharply in several regions. State salaries for officials ceased. Without a central treasury, courts could no longer impose decisions beyond local jurisdictions. Legal authority survived in principle, but not in imperial practice. Law became dependent on local enforcement rather than centralized command. Roman infrastructure did not disappear. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and city walls remained in use where maintenance was possible. Urban centers declined in population, but continued to function as local hubs. Markets operated at a reduced scale. Churches remained active centers of organization. Literacy declined unevenly, not universally, and remained concentrated among clerical and administrative elites. Roman landholding patterns persisted. Large estates continued to operate, worked by dependent agricultural labor. Contracts, land boundaries, and inheritance customs survived, often preserved through local record-keeping or customary practice. The disappearance of imperial oversight did not erase existing social hierarchies. It altered how those hierarchies were maintained. In Western Europe, political authority fractured along regional lines. Power shifted toward military leaders who controlled territory through armed retainers. These leaders often ruled in cooperation with Roman elites rather than replacing them. Administrative continuity depended on local conditions rather than imperial direction. Governance became situational and negotiated. In contrast, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to function as a centralized state. Based in Constantinople, it maintained professional armies, regular taxation, and bureaucratic administration. Imperial law was enforced across provinces. Officials were appointed through centralized procedures. Currency remained stable. The Eastern government regarded itself as the Roman Empire in full continuity with the past. This division produced two distinct political conditions within the former Roman world. In the East, imperial authority remained intact. In the West, imperial authority dissolved into regional power structures. This divergence defined how authority operated across former Roman territories. During the 5th century, Western Europe experienced repeated territorial changes. Groups such as the Visigoths, Vandals, Burgundians, and Franks established control over former Roman provinces. These transitions were not uniform. Some regions experienced prolonged conflict. Others underwent negotiated transfers of authority. In many cases, Roman administrative frameworks were preserved in modified form. Military control did not automatically replace civilian structures. Local Roman aristocracies often retained land, status, and influence. These elites provided continuity in governance, legal practice, and taxation at a reduced scale. New rulers relied on existing systems to manage populations and resources. The concept of empire retained symbolic importance even as administrative reality faded. Titles, laws, and rituals associated with Roman authority continued to be used. Claims to legitimacy were often framed in Roman terms. The idea of Rome survived as a reference point long after its Western institutions ceased to operate. Christian institutions expanded during this period. Bishops assumed increasing responsibility for local administration. Churches functioned as centers of social organization, dispute resolution, and charity. Ecclesiastical networks preserved literacy and record-keeping. Religious authority did not replace political authority directly, but it filled gaps left by imperial withdrawal. Population patterns shifted gradually. Urban populations declined as long-distance trade contracted. Rural settlement became more dominant. Agricultural production remained the primary economic activity. Exchange networks persisted at local and regional levels rather than imperial scale. These changes reflected reduced coordination rather than economic collapse. The military landscape changed as well. Professional standing armies were no longer maintained by the Western state. Armed forces became localized, tied to individual leaders or communities. Defense relied on fortified settlements, local militias, and negotiated arrangements rather than imperial deployment. Legal continuity remained uneven. Roman law codes were still copied and referenced, particularly in regions with a strong clerical presence. However, enforcement depended on the local authority. Customary law gained importance where written law lacked institutional backing. Legal pluralism became common, with Roman, local, and emerging customary practices operating simultaneously. The end of Western imperial rule did not produce immediate cultural uniformity or isolation. Contacts continued between regions. The Mediterranean remained a zone of exchange, particularly through the Eastern Roman Empire. Goods, ideas, and religious practices circulated, though at reduced volume compared to earlier centuries. By the early 6th century, Western Europe had entered a new political condition. No single authority coordinated taxation, law, or military defense across the former imperial territory. Governance became local and personal rather than institutional and centralized. Stability depended on relationships rather than systems. This transformation was not experienced uniformly. Some regions retained more Roman continuity than others. Southern Gaul and Italy preserved administrative practices longer than northern areas. Britain, already distant from imperial centers, experienced a sharper break from Roman governance. Iberia and parts of Gaul maintained stronger clerical and legal continuity. The absence of centralized authority did not eliminate order. It redefined how order was produced and maintained. Authority rested on land control, armed support, legal custom, and recognition by local elites. Power was exercised through presence rather than abstraction. By approximately 550 AD, Western Europe no longer operated within an imperial framework. The political world that emerged was decentralized, variable, and regionally defined. Roman civilization had not vanished, but it no longer functioned as a unified system. What followed was a prolonged period of adaptation to governance without empire. By the early 6th century, imperial authority in Western Europe no longer existed as a centralized governing force. What remained were territories populated largely by Roman-descended communities, organized around inherited legal customs, landholding systems, and Christian institutions. Political control passed to new ruling groups who occupied former imperial provinces, but these rulers did not encounter an empty administrative landscape. They governed societies that still operated according to Roman expectations of law, taxation, and legitimacy. Across Western Europe, different political formations emerged. In Gaul, Frankish rulers consolidated control over territories that had once been administered by Roman officials. In Iberia, Visigothic kings governed a predominantly Roman population. In Italy, Ostrogothic and later Lombard rulers established authority over regions that retained deep administrative traditions. Each kingdom followed a distinct trajectory shaped by geography, population density, and prior imperial integration. Despite these differences, the basic challenge was shared. The new rulers lacked the institutional capacity of the Roman state. They did not possess professional bureaucracies capable of uniform taxation or law enforcement across large territories. They did not maintain. Christianity played a central role in governance. By the 6th century, Christian belief was widespread across Western Europe. Bishops held authority within urban centers and acted as intermediaries between rulers and local populations. Churches maintained records, supervised charity, and provided continuity in administration. New rulers relied on ecclesiastical structures to legitimize authority and manage populations. Landholding remained the foundation of power. Large estates continued to dominate agricultural production. Control of land provided access to labor, food supply, and military support. New rulers often confirmed existing land rights rather than redistributing property on a large scale. This continuity helped stabilize governance, but limited the development of centralized control. Taxation systems have changed significantly. Under Roman rule, taxes had been assessed systematically across provinces. In the 6th and 7th centuries, taxation became irregular and localized. Rulers extracted resources through land revenues, tribute, and service obligations rather than standardized fiscal systems. Coinage circulated unevenly, with monetary exchange declining in some regions while persisting in others. Military organization reflected these changes. Armies were no longer maintained as permanent state institutions. Armed forces consisted of retainers, regional levies, and temporary assemblies of warriors. Military power was personal rather than institutional, tied to loyalty and reward. Defense depended on fortifications, local militias, and negotiated settlements rather than imperial deployment. Urban life continued at a reduced scale. Former Roman cities remained centers of administration, trade, and religious activity, but populations declined. Long-distance trade networks weakened, though regional exchange persisted. Ports in the Mediterranean maintained connections with the Eastern Roman Empire, facilitating limited commercial and cultural exchange. The Eastern Roman Empire remained an important reference point. Its continued existence as a centralized state influenced Western political culture. Diplomatic contact, trade, and religious exchange connected Western rulers to imperial models of authority. However, Western kingdoms did not replicate Eastern administrative systems due to limited resources and different social conditions. Political authority in Western Europe remained unstable. Kingship was often itinerant, exercised through movement rather than fixed capitals. Succession was frequently contested. Authority expanded through conquest and alliance, but contracted when leadership weakened. Without institutional continuity, political boundaries shifted regularly. Despite instability, governance was not arbitrary. Rulers issued laws, convened assemblies, and negotiated with elites. Custom and precedent shaped political practice. The expectation of order persisted even as mechanisms varied. Authority depended on recognition rather than coercive reach. Regional variation remained significant. Southern Gaul and Italy retained more Roman administrative practices than northern regions. Iberia maintained strong clerical and legal traditions. In Britain, Roman governance had collapsed earlier, resulting in different political formations. These differences reflected the uneven legacy of Roman rule. By the 7th century, Western Europe consisted of multiple kingdoms governed through adapted Roman systems rather than newly invented structures. Roman law, Christian institutions, and landholding patterns continued to shape governance. The absence of centralized imperial authority did not erase order, but altered how authority was exercised and maintained. These political systems were functional within their constraints. They provided local stability, enabled resource extraction, and supported social hierarchy. At the same time, they lacked the capacity for uniform administration across large territories. Power remained personal, negotiated, and contingent. By the end of the 7th century, Western Europe had settled into a pattern of regional governance. Kingdoms were defined less by fixed borders than by networks of loyalty and control. Roman traditions persisted in modified form, providing continuity amid political change. The societies that emerged were neither Roman nor entirely new, but adapted to governance without an empire. By the early 6th century, Western Europe lacked a centralized political authority capable of administering territory on an imperial scale. In this environment, institutions that possessed continuity, literacy, and organizational reach gained increased importance. Among these, the Christian Church expanded its role across social, legal, and administrative domains. This expansion did not replace secular authority but operated alongside it, filling functions that imperial government no longer performed consistently. Christian communities had existed throughout the Roman Empire before the end of Western imperial rule. By the 5th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion across most of Western Europe. Churches were established in urban centers, rural settlements, and former administrative hubs. Bishops emerged as prominent figures in local governance, particularly in cities where Roman administrative offices had declined. The Church maintained organizational continuity through a hierarchical structure that linked local congregations to regional and transregional authority. Bishops oversaw dioceses that often corresponded to former Roman administrative boundaries. This continuity allowed ecclesiastical administration to persist where secular governance had weakened. Church councils provided forums for coordination, standardization, and dispute resolution. Literacy became increasingly concentrated within ecclesiastical institutions. Clergy were trained to read and write Latin, the language of administration and record-keeping. Monasteries preserved texts, copied legal documents, and maintained archives. Written communication allowed the church to manage land, adjudicate disputes, and transmit regulations across regions. Land ownership expanded steadily during this period. Churches and monasteries acquired land through donations, grants, and inheritance. These holdings generated agricultural output that supported clerical communities and charitable activity. Control of land provided material stability and administrative capacity. Ecclesiastical estates were managed through stewards and local agents, often using practices inherited from Roman estate management. The church's role in law expanded in response to administrative gaps. Bishops frequently acted as judges in disputes involving property, contracts, and personal status. Ecclesiastical courts addressed matters related to marriage, inheritance, and clerical discipline. While secular law remained operative, ecclesiastical adjudication provided a parallel mechanism for resolving conflicts. Charitable activity was a visible component of ecclesiastical presence. Churches distributed food, provided shelter, and supported vulnerable populations. These functions were organized through local parishes and monastic communities. Charitable administration reinforced the church's position within local society and increased reliance on ecclesiastical structures. Religious authority contributed to political legitimacy. Rulers sought recognition from bishops and ecclesiastical leaders to support claims to authority. Church rituals, including coronations and blessings, formalized political power. This interaction did not grant the church direct political control, but integrated ecclesiastical authority into governance. Monasticism expanded significantly between the 6th and 8th centuries. Monasteries followed a regulated communal life structured by written rules. These communities became centers of agricultural development, literacy, and administration. Monastic networks connected regions through shared practices and correspondence. Monasteries also served as repositories of knowledge and record-keeping. Ecclesiastical communication extended beyond local boundaries. Letters, synods, and councils facilitated coordination among bishops. Papal authority in Rome remained influential, though its reach varied by region and period. The Roman bishop acted as a reference point for doctrine and discipline rather than a centralized administrator of Western Europe. The Church's institutional resilience contrasted with the instability of secular authority. While kingship changed hands frequently and territorial control shifted, ecclesiastical offices persisted. Bishops often remained in place across political transitions, providing continuity in administration and legal practice. This stability increased the Church's importance in governance. Urban centers continued to host episcopal seats. Although city populations declined compared to Roman levels, cities remained nodes of administration, trade, and religious life. Churches often occupied prominent urban locations, including former civic buildings. This spatial continuity reinforced the Church's visibility and authority. The rural ecclesiastical organization expanded gradually. Parish networks developed to serve dispersed populations. Clergy provided religious services, collected tithes, and maintained records. These local structures extended ecclesiastical administration into the countryside, integrating rural communities into wider institutional networks. The Church's economic role grew. Education remained largely confined to ecclesiastical contexts. Schools associated with cathedrals and monasteries trained clergy and administrators. Instruction focused on literacy, scripture, and basic administrative skills. These educational activities supported the church's capacity to manage records and personnel. The church also served as a conduit for cultural transmission. Texts from the Roman period were preserved and copied. Liturgical practices standardized ritual life. Artistic and architectural forms maintained continuity with earlier traditions. These activities sustained elements of Roman culture within a transformed political environment. Ecclesiastical law developed alongside secular custom. Canon law addressed internal discipline and regulated aspects of social life. Written norms provided reference points for adjudication. While enforcement depended on the local authority, the existence of codified rules contributed to institutional coherence. By approximately 800 AD, the Church's role in Western Europe encompassed religious practice, land management, legal adjudication, education, and charitable organization. Its institutions provided continuity in a landscape characterized by political fragmentation. The Church did not replace secular power but structured the environment in which authority operated. Between the 8th and 10th centuries, Western Europe operated without centralized states capable of uniform administration across large territories. Political authority existed, but it was exercised through localized systems rather than institutional government. Order was maintained through personal relationships, customary obligations, and control of land rather than centralized law, taxation, or bureaucracy. This period is often described using the term feudal, but no single, uniform system governed Europe as a whole. Instead, authority functioned through a series of practical arrangements shaped by insecurity, limited resources, and the absence of imperial coordination. Power depended on who controlled land, armed force, and recognition within a given region. Land formed the primary basis of authority. Agricultural production sustained populations, provided surplus where possible, and supported armed retainers. Those who controlled land controlled access to food, labor, and protection. Landholding patterns inherited from the Roman period continued, but they were reorganized around local power structures rather than state administration. Relationships of protection and service structured political life. Local lords offered military protection and dispute resolution in exchange for labor, rent, or service. These relationships were not standardized across regions. Obligations varied according to local custom, available resources, and relative power. Authority rested on enforcement capacity rather than written law. Peasant communities formed the foundation of this system. Most people lived in small rural settlements and worked agricultural land. In return for access to land and protection, peasants provided labor services, produce, or payments. These arrangements were enforced through local authorities rather than centralized institutions. Custom-determined obligations are more often than written contracts. Justice operated through customary practice. Courts existed at local levels, presided over by lords, representatives, or assemblies. Decisions relied on precedent, witness testimony, and community recognition. Enforcement depended on the authority of those presiding rather than external coercion. Written law existed in some regions, particularly where clerical institutions were strong, but customary law dominated daily practice. Political authority was layered rather than hierarchical. Individuals often owed obligations to multiple superiors. A local lord might recognize the authority of a regional ruler while maintaining control over local affairs. These overlapping loyalties created flexible but unstable political arrangements. Authority was negotiated rather than imposed uniformly. Military organization reflected these conditions. Standing armies were rare. Armed forces consisted of retainers supported through land grants, service obligations, or shared resources. Military service was tied to landholding rather than citizenship or state obligation. Campaigns were limited in scope and duration due to logistical constraints. Fortifications played an important role. Castles, fortified settlements, and defensive structures provided security in a landscape without centralized defense. Control of fortified sites enhanced the local authority. These structures were not merely military installations, but centers of administration and storage. Economic exchange remained largely local. Long-distance trade existed but was limited. Most production was consumed within local communities. Markets operated on a small scale, serving surrounding regions. Monetary exchange was uneven, with coinage circulating in some areas and barter remaining common in others. Authority depended on recognition. A ruler's power extended only as far as it was accepted by local elites and enforced through presence. Political boundaries were not fixed lines, but zones of influence that expanded or contracted according to circumstance. Governance relied on maintaining relationships rather than administering territory. Written administration was limited. Records existed where clerical institutions maintained literacy, but most obligations were defined orally and enforced through custom. Memory, precedent, and community knowledge played central roles in governance. This reliance on custom provided stability, but limited administrative scalability. Social hierarchy was clearly defined but locally determined. Status derived from landholding, military capacity, and recognition rather than formal office. Mobility was limited. Positions of authority were often hereditary, but succession was not guaranteed. Disputes over inheritance and control were common. The absence of centralized authority did not eliminate coordination entirely. Regional rulers convened assemblies to issue judgments, confirm land grants, and manage disputes. These gatherings provided forums for negotiation rather than legislative bodies. Decisions depended on consensus among powerful participants. The church operated within this environment, providing literacy, record-keeping, and legal frameworks, but it did not replace secular authority. Ecclesiastical institutions interacted with local power structures, reinforcing some arrangements while moderating others. Church courts addressed specific matters, but did not impose universal jurisdiction. Regional variation was significant. Some areas retained stronger remnants of Roman administrative practice. Others relied almost entirely on customary arrangements. Geography, population density, and prior imperial integration shaped how authority functioned in each region. In this context, political stability was relative and temporary. Periods of order were often followed by fragmentation. Authority expanded through alliance, inheritance, or conquest, and contracted when enforcement capacity weakened. Governance adapts continuously to changing conditions. The absence of a state apparatus meant that governance was personal. Authority was exercised through face-to-face relationships rather than abstract institutions. Protection, justice, and obligation were experienced locally rather than through distant administration. This system functioned within its limitations. It provided security, regulated land use, and maintained social hierarchy. At the same time, it constrained economic growth, limited political integration, and depended on continual negotiation. Stability required constant maintenance. By approximately 1000 AD, Western Europe remained organized around these localized systems of authority. Political power was distributed across numerous centers rather than concentrated in centralized states. Order persisted without uniform governance, shaped by land, custom, and recognition rather than bureaucracy. This form of governance defined daily life for most inhabitants of Western Europe during this period. It represented neither chaos nor centralized control, but a mode of organization adapted to conditions of limited resources and fragmented authority. By the mid-8th century, Western Europe consisted of multiple kingdoms governed through localized authority, customary obligation, and land-based power. Among these, the Frankish kingdom had emerged as one of the most territorially expansive and militarily capable. Its rulers exercised authority through land control, military retinues, and alliances with ecclesiastical institutions. This context shaped the consolidation of power that occurred during the reign of Charlemagne. Charlemagne came to rule the Frankish kingdom in 768 AD. His authority extended over regions that included much of present-day France, parts of Germany, northern Italy, and neighboring territories. Expansion occurred through sustained military campaigns that brought additional lands under Frankish control. These conquests increased the size of the realm, but also expanded the administrative demands placed on royal authority. Governance across this territory relied on existing structures rather than newly created state institutions. Royal authority was exercised through personal presence, appointed officials, and cooperation with local elites. Counts and other representatives were assigned responsibility for administering justice, collecting revenues, and maintaining order within defined regions. These officials were accountable to the ruler, but operated largely within local contexts. Assemblies played an important role in governance. Regional and general assemblies brought together nobles, clergy, and royal representatives. These gatherings served as venues for issuing legal decisions, confirming land grants, and addressing disputes. Decisions were recorded in capitularies, which outlined the church formed a central component of governance. Ecclesiastical institutions provided literacy, record-keeping, and ideological legitimacy. Bishops and abbots participated in administration and advised on legal and organizational matters. Monasteries served as centers of education and documentation. Cooperation between royal and ecclesiastical authority supported efforts at coordination across the realm. Educational reform occurred within this framework. Schools associated with monasteries and cathedrals trained clergy and administrators in reading, writing, and basic computation. These reforms improved administrative capacity but remained limited in scope. Literacy expanded among clerical and administrative elites rather than the broader population. Territorial integration relied on travel and inspection. Royal officials conducted circuits to oversee local administration, hear disputes, and enforce decisions. Communication depended on messengers and written correspondence. The absence of permanent administrative offices required continual movement to maintain authority. Military organization remained personal and land-based. Armed forces were raised through obligations tied to landholding and loyalty. Campaigns were seasonal and depended on available resources. Logistics constrained the duration and reach of military operations. Military success reinforced authority but did not create permanent institutional structures. Economic resources are derived primarily from land revenues. Royal estates provided agricultural output that supported the court and military activities. Tribute and service obligations supplemented these resources. Taxation in the Roman sense did not exist across the realm. Fiscal capacity depended on land control rather than standardized assessment. In 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned emperor in Rome. This event symbolized the revival of imperial authority in Western Europe. The title conveyed recognition of his territorial control and his relationship with the Church. It did not, however, establish a centralized imperial administration comparable to that of the Roman Empire. The imperial designation reflected status rather than structural transformation. Following the coronation, governance continued to rely on existing mechanisms. No new centralized bureaucracy was created. Administrative practices remained dependent on personal authority, local enforcement, and ecclesiastical cooperation. The title of emperor did not alter the practical limits of governance. Succession arrangements remained unresolved. Authority within the realm depended on personal rule rather than institutional continuity. The division of territory among heirs followed established Frankish practice. This approach preserved elite support but fragmented authority. The lack of standardized succession rules limited long-term stability. Toward the end of Charlemagne's reign, administrative strain became evident. Managing a large and diverse territory required constant oversight. Local officials exercised significant autonomy. Enforcement varied by region. Coordination depended on communication networks that were slow and uneven. Charlemagne died in 814 AD. Following his death, the unity of the realm weakened rapidly. Authority is fragmented along existing regional lines. The administrative mechanisms that had supported coordination depended heavily on personal leadership. Without a centralized institutional framework, cohesion diminished. The imperial title persisted, but it no longer corresponded to unified control over Western Europe. Political authority reverted to regional rulers who exercised power through land, loyalty, and local enforcement. The period of territorial unity proved temporary. The experience of Charlemagne's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and limits of large-scale rule in early medieval Western Europe. Expansion and coordination were achievable through personal authority, military success, and ecclesiastical cooperation. Sustained unity without institutional structures was not. By the early 9th century, Western Europe returned to a pattern of regional governance. The memory of empire remained as a political reference, but practical administration continued to rely on localized systems. Authority operated through networks of obligation rather than centralized state institutions. This period established important precedents in governance, law, and ecclesiastical cooperation. It also revealed the constraints imposed by limited administrative capacity, fiscal resources, and communication. These conditions shaped the political landscape of Western Europe during and after Charlemagne's reign. Charlemagne's rule represented an effort to coordinate authority across a fragmented landscape using available mechanisms. The results were significant but temporary. The structures of governance remained dependent on personal leadership rather than institutional continuity. By the end of this period, Western Europe had experienced a brief phase of large-scale political integration followed by renewed fragmentation. The imperial experiment altered the political vocabulary of the region without transforming its underlying administrative foundations. Between the 9th and early 12th centuries, the daily life of most people in Western Europe was shaped by agricultural production and local obligation. Political authority, religious institutions, and military power existed above this level. but they were dependent on rural communities for resources and labor. Understanding medieval Europe during this period requires examining how the majority of the population lived and how agricultural systems structured society. Most people lived in small rural settlements consisting of a few dozen households. These settlements were typically organized around arable fields, pasture land, woodland, and access to water. The economy was primarily subsistence-based. Agricultural production focused on meeting local needs rather than generating surplus for distant markets. Crop yields were limited by soil quality, climate, and available technology. The basic unit of rural organization was the manor. A manor consisted of land controlled by a lord, including fields worked directly for the lord's benefit and plots assigned to peasant households. Peasants cultivated their own plots while also providing labor services, produce, or rents to the lord. These obligations were defined by custom rather than uniform law and varied from region to region. Agricultural labor followed seasonal cycles. Fields were prepared in spring, crops were harvested in summer or early autumn, and winter months were devoted to maintenance and limited production. Failure at any stage could reduce food supply. A single poor harvest caused shortages. Consecutive poor harvests led to famine. Storage capacity was limited, and preservation techniques were basic. Most agricultural work was performed manually, supplemented by animal traction. Tools such as plows, sickles, and hoes were simple but effective within their constraints. Oxen and horses were used where available, though ownership of animals varied by household. Productivity remained low compared to later periods, placing firm limits on population growth and economic expansion. Peasant households were largely self-sufficient. They produced grain, vegetables, and livestock products for consumption. Craft production occurred at the household or village level, including textile work, tool repair, and basic construction. Specialized production existed but was limited in scale. Exchange with nearby settlements supplemented local production. Land tenure defined social status. Peasants held land according to inherited custom rather than ownership in a modern sense. Rights to cultivate land were often tied to obligations of service. Mobility was limited. Leaving the manor typically required permission from the lord or the settlement community. These arrangements provided stability but constrained individual autonomy. Lords derived authority from land control and protection capacity. Manorial lords exercised jurisdiction over local disputes, enforced obligations, and collected rents. This authority was exercised directly through local agents rather than through distant administration. Enforcement relied on presence and recognition rather than formal institutions. Justice at the manorial level addressed disputes over land use, labor obligations, and customary rights. Courts were convened periodically and attended by local inhabitants. Decisions were based on custom, precedent, and communal knowledge. Written records existed in some regions, particularly where ecclesiastical institutions were involved, but oral tradition dominated. The church played a role in rural life through parish organization. Parish churches served as centers for religious practice, record-keeping, and community gathering. Clergy collected tithes, which represented a portion of agricultural output. These resources supported ecclesiastical structures and charitable activities. Parish boundaries often followed settlement patterns. Disease was a persistent factor in rural life. Illness reduced labor capacity and increased vulnerability during shortages. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatment relied on local practice and ecclesiastical care. Mortality rates were high, particularly among children. Population levels fluctuated in response to harvest success and disease incidents. Housing reflected available materials and local conditions. Manorial organization varied by region. In areas with stronger remnants of Roman administration, written records and defined obligations were more common. In other regions, arrangements were informal and flexible. Geography, soil quality, and population density influenced local practices. Environmental factors shaped agricultural outcomes. Weather variability affected crop yields. Floods, droughts, and cold periods reduced production. Soil exhaustion occurred where land was overworked. Fallow practices were used to restore fertility, limiting the amount of land cultivated at any one time. Population growth during this period was gradual and uneven. Where conditions allowed, settlement expanded into marginal land. Forests were cleared and wetlands drained to create new fields. These expansions increased output, but also exposed communities to environmental risk. Social hierarchy within rural communities was clearly defined. Lords occupied the top position, followed by free peasants and unfree laborers. Status determined obligations and rights. While variation existed, these distinctions structured daily interactions and access to resources. Education was limited at the rural level. Literacy was rare outside clerical contexts. Knowledge was transmitted orally through practice and tradition. Skills were learned through participation rather than formal instruction. This limited administrative capacity and reinforced reliance on custom. The manor functioned as both an economic and a social system. It organized production, regulated obligations, and provided basic governance. While it constrained mobility and innovation, it also offered a framework for survival in an environment with limited resources and weak centralized authority. By the early 12th century, this rural system remained dominant across much of Western Europe. Despite regional variation, the manor continued to shape how land was used, how labor was organized, and how authority was exercised at the local level. Political and ecclesiastical institutions depended on this foundation for resources and stability. The conditions of rural life imposed clear limits on broader social development. Agricultural productivity constrained population size, surplus generation, and administrative complexity. These constraints shaped the pace and direction of change across medieval Europe during this period. From approximately the late 10th century into the 12th century, Western Europe experienced a broad expansion in population, agricultural output, and economic activity. This expansion unfolded unevenly across regions, but marked a clear departure from the long period in which growth had been limited by low productivity and frequent shortages. The changes that occurred during this period were cumulative and structural rather than sudden or uniform. Agricultural production increased across much of Western Europe. Several developments contributed to higher yields. Cultivation expanded into previously marginal land through forest clearance, drainage of wetlands, and settlement of upland areas. Existing fields were worked more intensively, and fallow practices were adjusted to maximize output where soil conditions permitted. These changes increased the total area under cultivation and the volume of food produced. Agricultural tools and methods also evolved. Heavier plows capable of turning dense soils were used more widely in regions with suitable terrain. The use of animal traction increased where resources allowed, improving efficiency in plowing and transport. Crop rotation practices varied by region. but arrangements that alternated different crops and fallow land helped maintain soil fertility. These methods were not universally adopted, but where implemented, they contributed to more stable production. Population growth followed increased food availability. Villages expanded, and new settlements were founded. Population density rose in fertile regions, while frontier areas absorbed settlers seeking land. Growth remained constrained by environmental limits, but overall numbers increased compared to earlier centuries. This demographic change affected labor availability, land use, and social organization. Settlement patterns shifted as a result. Existing villages grew in size, and new ones appeared near arable land, water sources, and trade routes. In some regions, planned settlements were established with defined layouts. These developments reflected increased coordination at local and regional levels rather than centralized direction. Economic activity expanded alongside agricultural growth. Surplus production allowed for greater exchange beyond immediate subsistence needs. Local markets increased in number and frequency. Weekly or seasonal markets provided venues for exchanging grain, livestock, tools, and craft goods. These markets connected rural producers with nearby towns and facilitated regional trade. Urban centers revived in many areas. Former Roman cities that had declined in population began to grow again, while new towns emerged at strategic locations such as river crossings, ports, and crossroads. Urban growth varied by region, but towns increasingly functioned as centers of trade, administration, and specialized production. Craft specialization expanded within towns. Artisans produced goods such as textiles, metalwork, pottery, and leather items. Production remained largely small-scale but supported local and regional demand. Craft activity contributed to the diversification of the economy and reduced reliance on household production alone. Monetary exchange became more common as trade increased. Coinage circulated more widely, particularly in areas with active markets and urban centers. While barter persisted, especially in rural areas, the use of money facilitated taxation, rent payments, and commercial exchange. Monetary systems remained fragmented, with multiple coin types in circulation. Long-distance trade revived gradually. Trade routes connected Western Europe with the Mediterranean, the British Isles, and regions to the east. Goods such as salt, wine, cloth, metals, and luxury items moved across these networks. Maritime trade increased in coastal regions, while river systems facilitated inland transport. These exchanges reconnected regions that had been economically isolated for centuries. Institutional structures adapted to expanded economic activity. Lords, towns, and ecclesiastical institutions developed mechanisms to regulate markets, collect dues, and enforce standards. Weights, measures, and tolls were established to manage trade. These measures were local rather than standardized across large territories, but reflected increased administrative complexity. Social organization evolved alongside economic growth. Increased surplus allowed some households to specialize in non-agricultural activities. Merchants, artisans, and administrators formed distinct social groups, particularly in urban settings. Social hierarchy remained pronounced, but economic roles became more varied. Land use intensified in response to demand. Marginal lands were brought into cultivation, increasing output, but also exposing communities to environmental risk. Soil exhaustion and overuse occurred in some areas, requiring adjustments in farming practices. These pressures highlighted the limits of expansion based solely on land extension. Political authority adapted to changing conditions. Rulers and lords benefited from increased production through rents, dues, and service obligations. Greater surplus supported military activity, construction, and administration. At the same time, managing larger populations and economic networks required new forms of coordination. Legal and administrative practices expanded in response to complexity. Written records became more common in contexts involving property, contracts, and urban regulation. Literacy remained limited, but its practical importance increased. Ecclesiastical institutions continued to provide administrative support through record-keeping and adjudication. Infrastructure development accompanied growth. Roads, bridges, mills, and storage facilities were constructed or repaired to support transport and production. Water mills expanded in number, providing mechanical power for grain processing and other tasks. These installations improved efficiency and supported population growth. Regional variation remained significant. Fertile areas experienced sustained expansion, while less productive regions saw limited growth. Climatic conditions influenced outcomes, with periods of favorable weather supporting agriculture. These variations produced uneven development across Western Europe. The expansion of towns altered rural-urban relationships. Rural producers supplied towns with food, while towns provided manufactured goods and market access. This interdependence reshaped economic organization and increased the flow of goods and information. Urban institutions began to assert authority over surrounding territories in some regions. The church continued. By the end of this period, Western Europe was more densely populated, more economically active, and more interconnected than in earlier centuries. These changes altered the scale at which social, economic, and political systems operated, setting the conditions for further institutional development. Between the mid-11th and mid-13th centuries, ecclesiastical institutions in Western Europe exercised an expanded range of authority across religious, legal, economic, and political domains. This period was characterized by the consolidation of clerical organization, the formalization of canon law, and increased interaction between ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The Church did not function as a centralized state, but it operated as a coordinated institutional network with influence across regional boundaries. By the 11th century, clerical organization had become more standardized. Diocesan structures were reinforced, and episcopal oversight expanded. Bishops supervised clergy within defined territories and enforced discipline through regular visitation and regulation. Parish systems became more consistent, integrating rural populations into ecclesiastical administration. These structures improved oversight and coordination within the Church. Reform initiatives addressed clerical conduct, appointment procedures, and institutional discipline. Ecclesiastical offices were increasingly defined by formal rules rather than local custom alone. Regulations sought to standardize qualifications, restrict the holding of multiple offices, and clarify jurisdiction. These measures altered how authority was exercised within the Church and affected its interaction with secular rulers. Control over appointments became a central issue. Bishops and abbots held authority over land, courts, and local administration. Secular rulers had long participated in appointing clerical officials within their territories. During this period, ecclesiastical regulations sought to limit secular involvement in these appointments. This shift redefined the distribution of authority without establishing uniform outcomes across all regions. Canon law developed as a systematic body of written regulation. Collections of ecclesiastical rulings, conciliar decisions, and papal directives were compiled and circulated. Canon law addressed matters of clerical discipline, marriage, inheritance, and procedure. Written norms provided reference points for adjudication across regions, contributing to institutional coherence. Ecclesiastical courts expanded their scope. These courts addressed cases involving clergy and matters under canon law jurisdiction. Procedures emphasized written documentation, witness testimony, and formal process. While enforcement depended on cooperation with secular authorities, ecclesiastical courts offered an alternative forum for legal resolution. Educational institutions expanded alongside legal development. Cathedral schools and emerging centers of higher learning trained clergy and administrators in theology, law, and basic sciences. Instruction emphasized literacy, logic, and interpretation of texts. These institutions supplied personnel capable of managing complex administrative and legal tasks. Monastic institutions continued to play a significant role. Reformed monastic communities emphasized standardized rules, communal discipline, and economic management. Monasteries controlled extensive landholdings and engaged in agricultural production. Their estates contributed to regional economies and supported ecclesiastical activities. The church's economic presence was substantial. Land revenues supported clergy, institutions, and charitable functions. Tithes provided a regular source of income tied to agricultural output. Ecclesiastical estates employed laborers and managed resources through stewards and local agents. Economic administration reinforced institutional stability. Urban centers remained important nodes of ecclesiastical authority. Cathedrals dominated city landscapes and served as administrative hubs. Clerical officials participated in urban governance, regulating markets, recording transactions, and overseeing legal matters. Urban growth increased the church's interaction with commercial activity. The relationship between ecclesiastical and secular authority varied across regions. In some areas, cooperation prevailed, with rulers and clergy coordinating governance. In others, jurisdictional boundaries were contested. Conflicts emerged over legal authority, taxation, and appointment rights. These disputes were managed through negotiation, councils, and legal argument rather than uniform resolution. Papal authority increased in visibility during this period. The Bishop of Rome acted as a reference point for doctrinal and legal questions. Communication networks connected Rome with dioceses across Western Europe. Papal correspondence, councils, and legates facilitated coordination. The extent of papal influence varied by region and circumstance. Crusading activity, initiated during this period, intersected with ecclesiastical authority. Ecclesiastical institutions organized preaching, administration, and legal arrangements related to participation. Crusading altered resource allocation and administrative priorities, but did not replace existing governance structures. Ecclesiastical involvement in secular affairs expanded through legal and administrative functions. Clergy advised rulers, managed records, and mediated disputes. Written documentation increased, reflecting growing reliance on literacy and procedure. These practices supported more consistent administration without eliminating local variation. Social regulation formed part of ecclesiastical activity. Canon law governed marriage, inheritance, and moral conduct. Parish clergy enforced regulations through local oversight. These rules shaped social organization and family structures across regions. Institutional complexity increased as ecclesiastical functions expanded. Hierarchies of authority connected local parishes to regional and transregional structures. Decision-making involved councils, courts, and correspondence. This complexity required trained personnel and stable resources. Regional variation persisted. Some areas experienced strong ecclesiastical oversight, while others retained greater secular control. Political conditions, geography, and local customs influenced outcomes. Uniformity was an objective rather than an achieved reality. By the early 13th century, ecclesiastical institutions had reached a level of organization and influence unmatched in earlier medieval periods. Their authority extended across religious practice, legal adjudication, education, land management, and social regulation. This authority operated alongside secular power rather than replacing it. The Church's institutional framework provided continuity in a landscape of political diversity. Its administrative practices contributed to the management of expanding populations and economies. At the same time, its authority depended on cooperation with secular rulers and local communities. By approximately 1250 AD, the Church functioned as the most extensive transregional institution in Western Europe. Its reach was expressed through legal norms, educational systems, economic management, and administrative coordination. These functions defined the scope of ecclesiastical power during this period. The consolidation of ecclesiastical authority reflected adaptation to changing social and economic conditions. As Western Europe grew more complex, institutions capable of coordination and record-keeping expanded their role. The Church's position at the center of these developments shaped governance across the region during this time. From the late 11th century through the late 13th century, Western Europe became directly involved in sustained military and political activity beyond its immediate geographic boundaries. These actions, known collectively as the Crusades, linked European societies to the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East, and the Byzantine world. The Crusades did not represent a single, unified campaign, but a series of expeditions organized over nearly 2 centuries, each shaped by specific political, logistical, and institutional conditions. In 1095 AD, ecclesiastical authorities formally endorsed military expeditions directed toward regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. These expeditions were organized through existing political and ecclesiastical structures rather than through centralized state authority. Participation depended on regional rulers, local lords, and ecclesiastical administrators coordinating recruitment, financing, and logistics. The absence of centralized control resulted in variation in scale, composition, and outcomes across different campaigns. The mobilization of crusading forces relied on land-based systems of obligation and resource extraction. Participants were drawn primarily from the military elite, supported by retainers and non-combatants. Funding depended on personal wealth, land revenues, loans, and ecclesiastical contributions. In some cases, land was mortgaged. The Crusades influenced institutional development within Western Europe. Ecclesiastical and secular authorities developed procedures to manage the participation, property, and legal status of crusaders. Special legal protections were extended to participants, requiring administrative coordination. These measures reflected growing reliance on written documentation and legal process. Military practices evolved through exposure to different forms of warfare. Fortifications, siege techniques, and logistical organization adapted in response to conditions encountered during campaigns. Knowledge transfer occurred through observation and experience rather than formal instruction. These adaptations affected military activity within Europe as well. Crusading activity placed demands on agricultural and economic systems. Resources were diverted to support expeditions, affecting local production and labor availability. These pressures varied by region and over time, depending on the scale and frequency of participation. The Church played an organizational role throughout this period. Ecclesiastical authorities coordinated preaching, legal arrangements, and administration related to crusading. Church courts addressed disputes arising from participation, including property rights and obligations. These activities expanded ecclesiastical involvement in secular affairs without replacing existing governance structures. Crusading also affected relations between Western Europe and neighboring societies. Sustained contact altered diplomatic, commercial, and cultural interactions. Exchanges of knowledge, goods, and administrative practices occurred alongside military conflict. These interactions reshaped regional dynamics without producing uniform outcomes. By the mid-13th century, crusading activity had diversified in scope and geography. Campaigns targeted multiple regions, including the Eastern Mediterranean, Iberia, and parts of northeastern Europe. Each theater involved distinct political conditions and institutional arrangements. The term crusades encompassed a range of activities rather than a single coherent project. The decline of crusader-held territories in the Eastern Mediterranean occurred gradually. Maintaining a military presence required sustained resources and coordination. As support fluctuated, control weakened. By 1291 AD, major European-controlled strongholds in the region were lost. This marked the end of sustained European territorial presence in the Eastern Mediterranean under crusading arrangements. The effects of the Crusades within Western Europe persisted beyond individual campaigns. Trade connections, administrative practices, and military knowledge continued to influence European societies. Urban centers engaged in Mediterranean commerce benefited from expanded networks. Legal and institutional mechanisms developed during this period remained in use. Crusading did not transform Western Europe into a centralized or unified political entity. Authority remained fragmented and locally exercised. The Crusades operated within existing structures of land-based power, ecclesiastical administration, and customary obligation. Their impact was cumulative rather than revolutionary. By the end of the 13th century, Western Europe's engagement with the wider world had intensified. Political, economic, and institutional connections extended beyond regional boundaries. These connections reshaped patterns of trade, warfare, and administration while remaining constrained by existing social and political structures. The Crusades represented a sustained period of outward engagement by Western European societies. They linked Europe to broader geopolitical systems without dissolving internal fragmentation. The processes involved reflected adaptation to opportunities and constraints rather than the creation of new governing models. From the early 13th century through the mid-14th century, political authority in Western Europe underwent measurable structural change. Warfare became more frequent, prolonged, and costly. Legal administration expanded in scope and complexity. These pressures altered how rulers governed territory, collected resources, and exercised authority. The developments of this period did not produce modern states, but they introduced institutional features that distinguished later medieval governance from earlier forms. Military activity during this period required sustained organization. Campaigns extended beyond seasonal operations and demanded greater logistical support. Maintaining armed forces required access to food supplies, transport, equipment, and coordination across wider territories. These demands increased the administrative responsibilities of rulers and their officials. The composition of military forces evolved. Armies increasingly combined feudal obligations with paid service. Mercenary forces appeared more frequently, particularly in regions with access to monetary resources. Payment required reliable revenue streams, encouraging rulers to formalize methods of resource extraction. This shift did not eliminate land-based service, but supplemented it with contractual arrangements. Fortifications expanded in scale and number. Castles, city walls, and fortified towns became central to military strategy. Siege warfare increased in importance as attackers sought to control territory through fortified points. The construction and maintenance of fortifications required labor, materials, and funding, further increasing administrative demands. Taxation became more systematic. While earlier rulers relied primarily on land revenues and customary dues, the costs of warfare prompted the collection of extraordinary taxes. These levies were often justified by specific military needs and approved through assemblies or councils. Over time, repeated taxation created expectations of regular contribution, even if assessment remained uneven. Administrative record-keeping expanded alongside taxation. Written registers documented landholdings, obligations, and payments. Officials were appointed to oversee collection and enforcement. These records improved consistency and accountability, though corruption and resistance persisted. The reliance on documentation reflected growing institutional capacity. Legal systems developed in response to administrative complexity. Courts expanded their jurisdiction and standardized procedures. Written law codes were compiled or updated, drawing on Roman legal principles, customary law, and royal legislation. Legal professionals emerged, trained in interpreting and applying written norms. Royal justice extended into regions previously governed primarily by local custom. Appeals to higher courts increased. Rulers asserted authority to adjudicate disputes involving land, inheritance, and obligations. This expansion of jurisdiction strengthened central authority while coexisting with local courts. Urban centers played an important role in these developments. Towns generated revenue through trade, tolls, and taxation. Urban administrations maintained records, enforced regulations, and supported military efforts. In return, towns often received privileges recognizing their legal and economic status. These arrangements integrated urban resources into broader political structures. Representative institutions developed as mechanisms for negotiation and consent. Assemblies composed of nobles, clergy, and urban representatives convened to approve taxation and address grievances. These bodies did not function as legislatures in a modern sense, but they provided forums for coordination between rulers and governed groups. The expansion of law and administration required trained personnel. Clerical officials and lay administrators managed records, finances, and courts. Education and literacy and legal procedure became increasingly important for governance. This demand supported the growth of schools and administrative training. Territorial authority became more clearly defined. Rulers increasingly identified authority with control over specific territories rather than solely over personal followings. Boundaries remained flexible, but the concept of territorial jurisdiction gained prominence. Governance focused on managing land and population within defined regions. Warfare also affected social structures. Military obligations and taxation placed burdens on rural communities. Resource extraction intensified during campaigns. These pressures required negotiation between rulers and local elites to maintain stability. Governance involved balancing enforcement with accommodation. The church remained involved in legal and administrative processes. Ecclesiastical courts continued to operate alongside secular courts. Clerical officials participated in record-keeping and administration. Canon law influenced procedural practices in secular contexts, particularly regarding evidence and documentation. Economic conditions shaped administrative capacity. Regions with active trade and monetary circulation supported more extensive. The disease moved along established trade and travel routes. Ports connected to Mediterranean commerce were affected first, followed by inland towns and rural areas. Transmission occurred within households, marketplaces, and transportation networks. Medical knowledge at the time did not provide an effective means of prevention or treatment. Mortality varied by location, but across Western Europe, population loss was extensive. Between 1347 and 1351, estimates indicate that approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population died. Urban centers experienced particularly high mortality due to population density and trade connections. Rural areas were also heavily affected, though timing and severity varied. Entire settlements were depopulated in some regions. Recovery was uneven and prolonged. The immediate effect of population loss was a sharp reduction in the labor force. Agricultural production declined as fields went untilled and livestock went unattended. Food supply chains were disrupted. In some areas, shortages followed. In others, reduced demand offset lower production. The balance between land and labor shifted decisively. Land became more abundant relative to labor. Survivors gained access to holdings that had previously been unavailable. Wages increased in regions where labor markets operated, reflecting competition among landholders for workers. Traditional obligations tied to landholding became harder to enforce as alternatives expanded for surviving peasants and laborers. These changes affected the manorial system. Lords faced difficulty maintaining customary labor services. In response, many converted labor obligations into rent payments or short-term contracts. The structure of rural production adjusted to reflect altered demographic conditions. These adjustments varied by region and depended on existing legal frameworks. Governments and landholders attempted to regulate labor conditions. Ordinances and statutes were issued in several regions to limit wage increases and restrict worker mobility. Enforcement depended on the local authority and administrative capacity. Compliance was uneven, and outcomes varied widely. Urban economies were also disrupted. Craft production declined due to labor shortages and reduced demand. Trade networks contracted temporarily. Over time, surviving artisans and merchants adapted to changed conditions. Guilds adjusted membership and regulations to manage the altered labor supply. Institutional capacity was strained. Administrative offices lost personnel. Record-keeping declined in some areas due to mortality among clerks and officials. Courts operated irregularly. Ecclesiastical institutions faced similar challenges as clergy mortality, reduced pastoral coverage. Replacement of trained personnel required time and resources. The church continued to provide religious services and administrative functions, but capacity varied by region. Parish organization was disrupted in heavily affected areas. Monastic communities experienced population loss that altered the economic management of estates. Ecclesiastical revenues declined in proportion to population loss. Public order was affected by economic pressure and administrative disruption. Disputes over labor, rents, and obligations increased. Courts addressed conflicts related to wages, contracts, and land tenure. Legal systems adapted to new conditions by clarifying rights and procedures. In several regions, collective resistance occurred in response to attempts to enforce pre-plague obligations. These events involved rural and urban populations contesting labor regulations, taxes, or jurisdictional authority. Such disturbances were localized and varied in scale. Authorities responded through negotiation, legal action, and, in some cases, force. The demographic impact of the plague altered long-term population trends. Growth halted or reversed for several decades. Settlement patterns changed as marginal land was abandoned and production concentrated in more fertile areas. Forests reclaimed some cultivated land, altering landscapes. Economic inequality shifted in complex ways. Some survivors accumulated property and improved status. Others faced continued hardship due to instability and local conditions. Regional variation remained pronounced, shaped by land quality, institutional response, and access to markets. Health conditions continued to influence population dynamics. Recurring outbreaks occurred in subsequent decades, preventing rapid recovery. Mortality remained higher than in earlier periods. These cycles reinforced caution in investment and expansion. Urban governance adapted to demographic change. Cities revised regulations related to trade, sanitation, and labor. Municipal authorities expanded record-keeping to manage altered conditions. Some cities stabilized and resumed growth by the late 14th century. Others declined permanently. Fiscal systems were affected by a reduced population. Tax bases shrank, limiting revenue for rulers and municipalities. To compensate, authorities adjusted assessment methods or sought alternative sources of income. These measures influenced political negotiation between rulers and governed groups. Military activity was constrained by reduced manpower and resources. Recruitment became more difficult. Campaigns were scaled to available capacity. Fortifications and defensive measures were maintained where possible, but faced funding challenges. Cultural and educational institutions also experienced disruption. Schools and centers of learning lost students and instructors. Recovery depended on the restoration of population and resources. Literacy remained concentrated among clerical and administrative groups. By the late 14th century, Western Europe had entered a period of adjustment rather than recovery to earlier conditions. The demographic baseline had shifted. Social and economic relationships reflected new ratios of land, labor, and capital. Institutions functioned differently under these constraints. The plague did not eliminate existing political or social structures, but it altered how they operated. The balance of power between landholders and laborers changed. Administrative practices evolved to address scarcity and instability. Legal systems incorporated new precedents related to labor and property. By approximately 1400 AD, Western Europe remained less populous than before the epidemic. Economic activity had stabilized in many regions, but growth remained limited. Social relations reflected adaptation to sustained demographic change rather than a return to earlier norms. The effects of the mid-14th century epidemic persisted across generations. Population levels, settlement patterns, and economic structures bore the imprint of loss and adjustment. These conditions shaped the environment in which subsequent political and economic developments unfolded. By the mid-15th century, Western Europe operated at a scale and level of complexity that differed markedly from earlier medieval conditions. Population levels had partially recovered from 14th century losses. Economic activity had stabilized in many regions. Political authority relied on administrative systems that were more durable than those of the early Middle Ages. These changes did not occur simultaneously or uniformly, but together they altered the conditions under which medieval institutions functioned. Political organization is increasingly centered on territorial authority. Rulers exercised control through defined jurisdictions supported by permanent administrative offices. Governance relied on written records, professional officials, and regularized procedures. Authority was no longer dependent solely on personal presence or negotiated loyalty. These arrangements increased continuity across successions and reduced reliance on ad hoc enforcement. Fiscal systems expanded in scope and regularity. Taxation was collected more consistently across territories through assessments based on land, trade, and population. Revenues supported standing administrative structures, fortifications, and military forces. Although fiscal capacity varied by region, reliance on regular taxation distinguished late medieval governance from earlier periods. Military organization reflected these changes. Armies increasingly combined feudal obligations with paid service. The use of infantry expanded, and recruitment relied on contracts and wages rather than land-based service alone. Sustained military readiness required reliable funding and administrative oversight, reinforcing the importance of fiscal institutions. Gunpowder weapons altered military practice. Artillery affected fortification design and siege warfare. Maintaining and deploying these weapons required specialized knowledge, materials, and infrastructure. States capable of supporting these requirements gained a military advantage. Adaptation to gunpowder technology favored centralized coordination over localized defense. Urban centers played a growing role in economic and political life. Towns generated revenue through trade, manufacture, and taxation. Urban administrations maintained records, enforced regulations, and negotiated privileges with rulers. Cities contributed resources to state building through loans, taxes, and logistical support. Commercial networks expanded in scale and reach. Long-distance trade connected Western Europe to the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and regions beyond Europe. Merchant organizations developed standardized practices for credit, contracts, and transport. These networks increased the circulation of goods, information, and capital. Financial institutions adapted to expanded trade and governance. Banking practices developed to manage loans, deposits, and currency exchange. Public debt became a tool for financing military and administrative expenditure. These financial mechanisms increased the capacity of rulers to mobilize resources. Legal systems continued to evolve. Written law codes were applied more consistently across territories. Courts operated through formal procedures and professional judges. Appeals processes expanded, and jurisdictional boundaries were clarified. Legal uniformity increased within territories, though variation persisted between regions. Education and literacy expanded beyond strictly ecclesiastical contexts. Universities and schools trained administrators, lawyers, and clerks. Instruction emphasized law, rhetoric, and record-keeping skills needed for governance. This educational infrastructure supplied personnel capable of managing complex institutions. Printing technology spread rapidly after the mid-15th century. Printed texts increased the availability of legal codes, administrative manuals, and educational materials. Production of books became faster and more uniform than manuscript copying. This change supported the standardization of knowledge and practice across regions. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked a geopolitical shift in the Eastern Mediterranean. Control of key trade routes changed hands. Western European states adjusted commercial strategies in response. The event altered diplomatic and economic conditions without directly transforming Western European institutions. Maritime activity increased as states and merchants sought alternative trade routes. Shipbuilding, navigation, and port infrastructure developed to support longer voyages. Coastal regions and maritime cities gained strategic importance. These developments extended European engagement beyond traditional regional networks. Territorial consolidation advanced during this period. Rulers reduced the autonomy of local authorities through administrative integration, legal reform, and fiscal control. Noble privileges were redefined within territorial frameworks. While local power did not disappear, it operated within more structured systems. Ecclesiastical authority continued to function as an important institutional presence, but its role changed. Secular rulers exercised greater control over church administration within their territories. Legal and fiscal autonomy of ecclesiastical institutions was increasingly regulated. The balance between ecclesiastical and secular authority shifted toward territorial governance. Population growth resumed in many regions, increasing demand for food, goods, and services. Agricultural production is adapted through improved land management and market integration. Rural economies became more connected to urban markets. These changes supported sustained economic activity. Administrative reach extended into rural areas. Officials assessed taxes, enforced laws, and maintained records beyond urban centers. This penetration reduced reliance on purely local custom. Governance became more uniform within territories while remaining variable across regions. Political identity increasingly aligned with territory rather than personal allegiance. Subjects were defined by residence within a jurisdiction rather than by direct ties to a ruler. This shift affected legal obligations, taxation, and military service. Diplomatic practices became more formalized. States maintained permanent representatives and conducted negotiations through written correspondence. Treaties defined borders, alliances, and obligations with greater precision. These practices reflected increased administrative capacity. By the late 15th century, the institutional environment differed from that of the early medieval period. Authority was exercised through systems capable of persistence beyond individual rulers. Economic activity operated through integrated markets. Legal and administrative practices emphasized standardization and record-keeping. These changes did not represent a sudden break. Medieval institutions continued to function and adapt. However, the scale, complexity, and durability of governance exceeded what earlier medieval systems had supported. The cumulative effect altered how society was organized and administered. By approximately 1500 AD, Western Europe had transitioned into a new phase of political, economic, and institutional development. The conditions that defined medieval governance, localized authority, limited fiscal reach, and reliance on custom, had been modified by expanded administration, regular taxation, and territorial organization. The Middle Ages did not end through collapse or replacement. They ended as medieval structures were transformed by accumulated change. Institutions evolved to manage larger populations, broader economies, and more complex forms of authority. These developments marked the conclusion of the medieval period in Western Europe.